Hi, today I want to show you preparing lino and getting it centred and mounted ready for a multi-block print. So when I say lino, the material that I use is traditional artist's lino. Sometimes it's called battleship, and it is made out of cork flour, wood flour, linseed oil, calcium carbonate, other additives. You may, if you're in Europe, know the brown version. In the UK it tends to be this grey stuff. There are other products available. There are vinyls largely from Japan that are often called safe cut or easy cut lino. I prefer to use traditional lino for a couple of reasons. It has a brittle snap to it, so when you make a cut into the lino, when you stop cutting, the lino just snaps off. With the vinyls and the soft cut and the easy cut, you have to cut in at the beginning of the cut and out at the end of the cut, or the material just tears. So I find the brittleness of this lino very good. It also, if you're cutting a very fine line and clearing away around that fine line, this is nice and sturdy. So especially if, like me, you usually use a printing press, it's much less likely to crush or sort of squidge. The downside of it is it does have a shelf life. Because it has linseed oil in it, over time that linseed will harden and the lino will become rock solid and brittle. And when it gets very hard, you can't cut it. So if you discover some lino that's been sat in the back of a cupboard for 5 years or something like that, and it at room temperature it's hard, it will never be any good for cutting. What you want is lino that is nice and bendy at room temperature. It should smell of linseed oil and it should be nice and easy to cut. And we're going to be looking at cutting later on. So this is the traditional lino, and it has a hessian or burlap backing. And one of the things about lino when you're using it is to make sure that you trim off any thready bits of that hessian, because what will happen is that when you're using this to print on, the ink will get onto that hairy bit and it will transfer onto your print. And so I would go around and just trim off with scissors and make sure that that's all gone before I start printing. But they can reappear during printing, so just always check the edges of your print as you go along, that there aren't any hairy bits that are going to stick on your work. When it comes to cutting this sort of lino, it is very easy to do if you know that it snaps nicely. So let me show you on this little sample piece. So I'm going to draw myself a guideline. And again, if you draw with pencil on your lino, you can rub that off. So pencil comes off very nice and easily. And then you can see I've got a cutting mat here for safety, and I'm using a nice straight edge, heavy straight edge. So I'm going to take Stanley knife or box cutter, and I replace the blades in these a lot. It's always worth having a fresh blade as often as you can, because especially if you're cutting lino, it tends to take the tip of the blade off fairly quickly, and then it's harder to use the knife. And if you're going between cutting lino and cutting paper, I would always use a fresh blade when you come to the paper, because it's so easy to tear it up if you've been cutting lino first with your box cutter or Stanley knife. So I'm just going to score the lino. Normally I do this standing, but for the sake of filming I'm doing everything sitting down. And then all I have to do is bend, and you'll see it bends nicely across the scored line. And then I just need to run my Stanley knife across the cut. So slide that through, and I've separated my two bits of lino. Very, very simple to do that. So that's cutting lino. Before I go on to the next bit, there is a really neat app I just wanted to recommend. It's called Die Cut, and it's an app that tells you how to divide a piece of material up efficiently into smaller pieces. So that's great if you've got a big sheet of paper that you want to cut into several pieces, or a piece of lino that you want to divide up into separate blocks. And the way that it works is it's really simple. You have a size at the top of the material you're using, and then you put in the size of the end product that you want. So I'll put my smaller pieces in here, and then it divides up the material and it gives you different layouts depending on what you want. So I find that really handy, especially when I'm teaching and I need to do lots of pieces of lino. So that's die cut, and I really recommend it as a neat little free app that I use all the time. So once you've got the lino chopped up into the pieces, it's a good idea to key the surface of it before you start printing, because lino's naturally sort of smooth and slightly repellent, especially if you're using water-based inks, because it's a waterproof product. But I do it with oil-based inks as well. So I have a sanding block here. That's a very cheap foam block with fine grade sandpaper. It's nothing special. It's not a particular grade. It's just a fairly fine one. And I would just go over it to key the surface. So I'm not a lot of sanding, just a little bit. You won't even see any difference. I mean, I don't know if you can see that, but it's just taken a little bit off the surface and put a little bit of a key on the surface. So now the lino is cut and ready to go, and I need to put it in the right place for cutting my lino cut out. Normally, if I was doing a reduction print, I could just pop it on a backing board. I would try and line it up in the centre, but it wouldn't really matter. But with a multi-block print, you really have to get it in the right place. So it's worth taking your time, and I'm going to show you how to do that. Before I get the lino positioned in the right place for printing, I'm going to stain it. You can see here, if you look on this side, I've got lino here that's been coloured pink. Let me move that out of the way. And the reason I do that is because my eyesight isn't brilliant, and I find having a contrasting colour allows me to cut more effectively. So I like to stain my lino. So this is lino that I've already sanded, like I showed you. And the stain I've made to do this is made up of white spirit or mineral spirit, and it's mixed with printing ink. So this is traditional oil-based printing ink. I guess there's nothing stopping you doing it with safe wash ink mixed with water, or water-based ink mixed with water. How long those will stay on the lino, I don't know. It depends. But with a multi-block print, you are going to cut it and then it's done. It's not like a reduction where you'd want the stain to stay on through layers and layers of cleaning. So I'm guessing that a water-based stain would work absolutely fine for this. I've gone with my usual mix of about, I guess, maybe 10% ink to 90% white spirit. And I should also have a little shout out for this device, in case you were wondering why I have a sort of crimped edge on this tin. On this tube. I bought one of these gizmos for squeezing the last remains out of tubes, and I have to say they are absolutely brilliant. They're very addictive. Once you've got one, you kind of want to do all the paint tubes immediately. And I posted this on Facebook a little while ago, and I got lots of people saying, well, I use my rolling pin and I use this and I use that, and that's absolutely fantastic. But if you look at this, I am so messy that if I used a rolling pin, then you would never ever be able to use it for pastry again. So I like that. That's quite good for getting the last little drips of ink out. So I've got my stain here, and you'll notice that I've got my vinyl gloves on. I like these vinyl gloves because you can use them again and again. They seem to be quite hard wearing. And I've got some paper towel here, and all I'm going to do is just have a little dunk and put away and put some stain on my lino. And I'm just going to rub it and just get it well rubbed into that lino. And before I print, I'm going to give it a good wiping with white spirit again, but I need to let that stain sit on the lino. If I wiped it immediately with white spirit now, it would just take it all off again. But if I leave it sitting on there for an hour or so, then when I wipe off, it'll take a little bit off the lino, but it will leave enough there to act as a stain. So if you're doing this, staining up your lino, leave it to sit. And I would say that also applies or if you're doing a water-based staining as well. Let the whole thing settle before you wipe off any excess, and the chances are the stain will stay there then. So now I've got my lino cut out, sanded and stained. I need to position 4 pieces of lino onto their backboards, and all of them need to be in the same place so that the whole lot register when I come to do my multi-block. So if we go back to my master tracing, so what I've done here is I've taken a tracing, and if you've watched the previous episode you'll remember that I drew myself a frame. The outside of the frame is the size of the aperture in the registration device. The inside of the dimension is the size of the lino. So I've got my registration device here. If you are using a different form of registration, then there'll be other ways, I'm sure, that you can line up your blocks in the right place, but I'm going to show you the method that I'm using. So I have my registration device here with the adaptation that I showed you in an earlier episode to accommodate the smaller paper samples that I'm going to use to print with. So I'm going to take my master tracing, and it is really important to remember to reverse your tracing and turn it face down if you want your print to come out in the same orientation as your drawing. It's a really easy step to forget, but remember, anything that you don't reverse is going to come out as the mirror image of your drawing. So I flip my tracing over so that it's face down, and now I'm going to put it on my device and just line that grid up with the aperture. And get myself some masking tape, and I'm going to line up my blocks this way rather than measuring them and just, it sort of sense says, well, if you just measure everything and stick your lino down in the centre of the board, everything will be fine. But actually, I think with a multi-block print, if I can use the tracing to put the board in the right place and then the tracing to put the image on the right place, there's less room for mistakes. The more removed from the original outline and the original tracing you get, the more chances there are for little errors to creep in. So I'm going to actually use my tracing to mark up the baseboard to stick the lino to. So I've got an insert here for my registration device. Now, with the registration device you get an MDF insert, and because I'm here I've got as many MDF inserts as I want, but you could also use hardboard, or you could use cardboard, or you could use mount board to cut yourself inserts for this device. And if you go back to my Lino with Laura series, there is a whole episode on different materials that you can use with the registration device. So as you can see, my insert fits in, and I'm going to close it back down, and I'm going to use carbon paper to transfer. And the carbon paper I got that on online, and it's double-sided, which isn't really important, it just happens to be double-sided, but it's a good quality carbon paper. If you buy really cheap carbon paper, it tends to be very sort of flimsy. The ink is very flimsy and it wipes off. Sort of the better quality carbon paper I find works better. People sometimes ask me about drawdown, which is another form of carbon, and I don't use it. I've never used it. I know it's more expensive than carbon paper, office carbon paper, but I've always used office carbon, and I'm going to show you how to prevent it from transferring to your print anyway. So here we go with the office carbon. So I'm just going to pop a little bit down there. So I'm going to use the same carbon paper for transferring the design onto the lino. Obviously, with the backing board, it doesn't matter if it transfers or not because it's not part of the print. So then it's just a matter of taking a ruler and marking where I want that lino to sit. The pencil I'm using here it's an H. I want a reasonably hard pencil, so I would use an H or a 2H or even higher, because when you're doing a tracing, the softer your pencil, the less accurate the result. So what that's done is to draw me a nice mark on the backboard where I need to put my lino. So all I need to do now is to fix my lino down in the right place, and to do that I am going to use carpet tile adhesive. Now you can use double-sided tape if you want to, if you're hand printing. I would never advise using double-sided tape if you are going to print on a press, because if you do use it, there is a danger that that tape will show up in the final print as a sort of darker stripe, because the press will put more pressure. The tape will act like it'll almost lift that bit of lino where the tape is, so you end up with these sort of dark stripes in the print. So always use glue if you're using a press, and always make sure your glue is nice and even over the whole piece of lino, so that you don't have any raised areas to make dark impressions on your print. So all I'm going to do with this is to open up. Now this glue, because I'm in lockdown, I can't go off to the DIY shop I would normally go to. You can, but there's massive queues, so I'm not going to do that. So you can see if you look at this one, this particular brand has gone mouldy, which is sort of super disgusting. However, it's like jam. There's unmouldy stuff underneath that. So I'm going to, I don't know if you're squeamish about jam, I'm quite happy to scrape mould off jam and eat it. But the glue is the same, the mouldy bit I've taken off. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to spread a nice even layer of glue onto the back of my lino. And I'm doing this because it's going to permanently fix it to this board, and I'll probably use these prints for demonstrating, so they're going to have a long life and I don't want them to shift. If you use double-sided tape and you're careful, you shouldn't have any problems, but if you want to go on having a lot of use out of your lino blocks, then I would recommend you glue them. Also, if you propose to store them, because it's easy to knock them when you put them into storage and knock the tape, so it's better to make sure it's a proper job if you want to keep them. So I'm going to take that now and just check I've got it where I want it and press that down. Now, what I would do then, and I won't put Ben through the agony of moving all the cameras, is I would put it on the floor and stand on it and make sure that the glue is nice and set. So Once that's set in place, then I'll take this one out, put the next board in and do exactly the same thing for all 4 of the blocks that I need for this particular print. And that way I know that when everything's lined up, everything will be in the same place and I can start transferring the images onto my blocks. I hope that's been useful and I hope you'll join me for the next film.